Maybe I don't need medication at all, I told my boyfriend before immediately realizing I was pouring my tea into the sink instead of a cup. This was a year ago, I could not decide if I wanted to try meds. It all seemed so surreal. Here I was questioning if I even had ADHD and how serious it actually might be, whilst simultaneously displaying classic symptoms and even bearing a clear diagnosis, supported by all the assessment tests. I've always been scattered. In elementary school, my teacher used to tell my parents, "Dan is really smart. But he's such a daydreamer." I don't blame her. I remember sitting in class, traveling to random places and events in my imagination, and suddenly realizing the teacher was calling my name for the third time. I kept forgetting to hand in my homework and return things. I also couldn't sit still. ADHD can feel like a constant itchiness inside your body. If you don't move, the itch gets stronger. I would constantly fidget with any object that happened to be nearby. And yet, I didn't need educational help. I was at the top of my class, if that's something you can say about elementary school. I never paid much attention, yet I usually figured things out. I couldn't read a book because it was too tiring, but I could skim read before a class and then give a convincing half-hour speech about the topic. When I entered 6th grade, I switched to a school aimed at children and parents who wanted a better education. As school got harder, my skim reading wasn't enough anymore and my performance declined. ADHD can feel like a constant itchiness inside your body. If you don't move, the itch gets stronger. Other people started noticing my quirks, which were no longer socially acceptable. I'd constantly laugh at random things, I still do, because my mind keeps making associations others find hard to follow. I would sometimes bump into objects. It was hard to follow conversations. I'd have too much energy, but didn't really know how to express it. It felt like people just explained away my tendencies. Some thought I was not the brightest bulb on the tree. Others, like my parents, believed it was my personality. My mom also has similar quirks. ADHD does run in families with an average heritability of 74% based on twin studies. But, in my mom's case, ADHD never reached the point of truly interfering with her life. "That's just the way we are," she said. Tragically funny, constantly behind, I often felt like a broken toy. One of the hard parts about ADHD is, paradoxically, that the symptoms are funny. People like to have a good laugh at someone else's expense. Especially if it's something innocent you have no control over, like dropping objects, speaking excessively, or being all over the place. I am no exception to this rule and I am comfortable laughing at myself for traits like clumsiness. That being said, you get tired eventually of being the one who is laughed at. And many people start treating you as incompetent. It's especially not nice when your teachers do that. I remember feeling trapped because I couldn't escape my own brain. At some point, school just became suffering. I was constantly sleep deprived because I couldn't maintain any routine and slept for 5 hours a day on average, which made my symptoms worse. I'd forget something every second day. I didn't have good relationships with my classmates. And I couldn't hold my attention, so I'd have to sit for 8 hours straight knowing it was a completely useless exercise, even if I tried my best. For someone like me, everyday tasks are incredibly difficult to tackle. ADHD is not just about attention and hyperactivity. Some of my issues are about executive functioning, such as planning and self-regulation. In a new understanding of ADHD in children and adults, clinical psychologist Thomas Brown describes this as a paradigm shift in the scientific understanding of ADHD. As Brown says, it's not just about naughty energetic children who can't pay attention, but about being burdened by a syndrome of chronic difficulties in focusing, getting started on tasks, sustaining effort, utilizing working memory and modulating emotions that chronically impair their ability to manage necessary tasks of daily life. Want to try it on for size? Imagine you need to tidy your room, but don't know where to start. There are just too many options. How do you go about it? You have a plan of some kind. But then you think of all the ways it's not going to work. So, you try to diversify and come up with new systems. But in the process, you start thinking about your walk the other day, and what was on TV last night. And all of a sudden, an hour has passed and you realize you haven't done anything. This is not even procrastination, because you didn't delay anything. Instead, you got lost inside your mind. For someone like me, everyday tasks are incredibly difficult to tackle. I'd often just think for an hour about how I might do things, get overwhelmed, feel crappy, and then not do anything. You also get into the habit of constantly starting millions of things. We love stimulation, but not finishing any of them, because it takes willpower and patience to keep going, and dealing with details is draining. You seem lazy to others. But actually you're just lost and resigned to the failure you anticipate. Supports and pitfalls. Luckily, my best friend at the time, who was also my classmate, kept being what psychiatrists Craig Sermon and Tom Bilkey, two of the authors of Fast Minds, How to Thrive If You Have ADHD, or Think You Might Call a Peripheral Brain, to me. My friend kept reminding me of important events and lending me objects I'd forget to bring in, as well as lecture notes. I will forever be grateful to him, because people who understand and offer some compensation for your symptoms make your life a lot less stressful. Eventually, I got into a dark place where I'd blame myself for everything. My escape from this was strange hobbies, which made me look even weirder in other people's eyes. Hobbies can easily become obsessions, sometimes life-saving ones, for people with ADHD. In that regard, attention deficit can be misleading. It's not really the experience of less attention, but rather the control of attention and its fluctuation. This sometimes results in a phenomenon called hyperfocus. It means you become so absorbed in whatever you're currently interested in, that you often forget about everything else. We all get into this state sometimes, but with ADHD, it happens way more frequently, and at random. It's a good thing if your hyperfocus centers on something you need to do, but unfortunately, this is not always the case. I went through a period of constantly talking about carnivorous plants. Then there was an era of cat breeds. And at some point, I ran into some self-help books and got completely absorbed in Buddhism. And thanks to that, I eventually began to feel like I might not be such a terrible person after all. I started working on my self-confidence and stopped blaming myself for everything. It took a long time, but eventually I no longer felt like a complete failure. I started building new social circles, and acquired some basic social skills that I was desperately lacking. And in high school, I even learned how to learn. I started using flashcards, which forced me to process information in chunks. I went through a period of constantly talking about carnivorous plants. Then there was an era of cat breeds. And at some point, I ran into some self-help books and got completely absorbed in Buddhism. Diagnosis and medication. I've heard many people express the opinion that a diagnosis is unnecessary and that you don't need to be labeled to work on yourself. This might be true if so many mental issues didn't require a specific approach. Sure, you are not your diagnosis. That doesn't mean it doesn't help to have one. If you have a physical disorder, you need to know what you're dealing with in order to treat it. The individual state of a patient should not be overlooked, but naming it is a start. And ADHD has its material cause in its neurobiological correlates. I first heard about ADHD when I started university. At that point in my life, I had loving friends and was deeply passionate about my chosen field, psychobiology. However, I still hated lectures, and could not properly learn from them. I compensated with textbooks and online resources and usually didn't even attend class. That made it a lot harder to perform well, as the grading system was heavily based on testing material covered in lectures, rather than assigning readings or rewarding good approaches to self-studying. One day, a friend going through medical school told me he was almost certain I had ADHD. I didn't believe him at first. But eventually, I looked into it. I tried a small screening test and scored fully. I asked some of my friends in psychology what they thought. No, you. ADHD? Those fluent movements and your omnipresent calmness. You think? Yes, please, do get tested. And so I did. I went through a few psychological tests and completed some questionnaires about my childhood, as did my parents. Good news is that we don't need to do any more tests. The bad news is that this was truly enough for your ADHD to be clearly shown, the psychologist told me. It was a relief. For all those years I'd felt broken, here was an explanation, and perhaps some solutions too. I started attending ADHD psychotherapy. It helped tremendously. One thing I learned is that we have to work with ADHD, not against it. Things that work easily for most people often don't work for us. For example, I can't have a fixed schedule. Instead, I need to make my schedule flexible enough that I can do tasks that are part of my hyperfocus at the moment. Medication was a game changer. Someone compared getting ADHD medication to getting glasses when nearsighted, and I think it's the most accurate description I've ever heard. It's as if you compare an old, crashing laptop with a smoothly running new beast. Now, of course, symptoms do not completely go away with medication. But it helps so much. Thanks to medication, I can follow lectures, organize myself, and I feel calmer inside. What's truly fascinating to me is that my boyfriend can tell when I forget to take my meds. He says I'm different on phone calls. If I take my stimulants, I'm able to follow the conversation and do things along with it, such as clean our dinner table or make food for myself. When I don't, I often wander aimlessly around the room, because I get distracted and cannot multitask. It's always weird when he asks if I forgot and I realize I did. Onward, I've come to understand that I will never feel as if I'm normal, my life experience will never be completely smooth. But I came to terms with my quirks and also found out that some people, including my boyfriend, find them cute. I consider my story a happy one. But what about all the people like me who never even consider that they might have ADHD? What about the people who keep living under the assumption that they're broken? After all, even when diagnosed, people with ADHD are statistically more likely to change jobs, take more days of absence, and have worse job performance in general. According to the National Comorbidity Survey, adults with ADHD are 3 times more susceptible to depression and 4 times more susceptible to mood disorders. ADHD also correlates with relationship issues and poor self-esteem. Despite my belief that diagnoses are important, people should not need a diagnosis so that their struggles become real. In my case, teachers and adults kept noticing the signs, but no one in the educational setting or outside of it ever asked me how I feel about them or what would help. To them, as long as you're getting okay grades, you're not struggling. I'm now doing quite well at university, because I'm not being forced to sit and focus for hours at a time. I can study on my own. I became passionate about science and even overcame my math phobia. Clearly, I am not broken. My issues were not my personal failure, but the failure of a dysfunctional educational and societal system. Increasingly, I'm happy to report, it feels good to be me.